The wind howled across the barren plains of Wyoming Territory, carrying with it the sting of sand and the promise of another harsh winter. Jacob McAllister stood at the edge of his property, watching the sun sink behind the jagged mountains that marked the western boundary of his world. His weathered hands gripped the fence post he'd driven into the ground 5 years ago, when he'd first claimed this unforgiving stretch of land as his own. The year was 1882, and at 34, Jacob had spent the last decade carving out a meager existence from the stubborn earth. His ranch sprawled across 200 acres of scrubland, dotted with sagebrush and rocky outcroppings that made farming near impossible. Instead, he ran cattle. When they survived the winters and the wolves and the drought that seemed to grip the land tighter each passing year, the cabin behind him stood as a testament to his solitude. Built with his own hands from timber hauled down from the distant hills, it consisted of a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a narrow bed pushed against the wall. No curtains softened the windows, no flowers grew in the yard. It was a dwelling meant for survival, not comfort. As darkness crept across the sky, Jacob made his way back to the cabin, his boots crunching on the dry grass. Inside, he lit the oil lamp and set about preparing his evening meal. Salt pork and beans, the same as yesterday, the same as tomorrow. The silence that filled the room was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat, a steady rhythm that had become his only companion through the long nights. He'd grown accustomed to the silence over the years. It had settled into his bones like the ache from old injuries, becoming part of who he was. But lately, something had shifted. The quiet that once brought peace now pressed against him like a physical weight. He found himself talking to the cattle, to his horse, even to the wind itself, just to hear the sound of a human voice, even if it was only his own. It was old Pete at the general store in Cheyenne who'd first mentioned the marriage brokers. Jacob had been loading supplies onto his wagon when the shopkeeper, never one to miss an opportunity for gossip, had leaned across the counter with a conspiratorial air. "Heard tell there's agencies back east now," Pete had said, his roomy eyes bright with interest. "They arrange marriages for folks like you, men out here on the frontier who need wives, send letters back and forth, make all the arrangements. Fellow over in Laramie just got himself a bride that way. Pretty little thing from Ohio, they say." Jacob had dismissed the idea at first. The thought of purchasing companionship like one might order a plow or a sack of seed corn sat uneasily with him. But as the weeks passed and winter approached, bringing with it the prospect of another 4 months trapped alone in his cabin while snow piled against the doors, the notion began to take root. He thought of his childhood back in Missouri, before the war had torn everything apart. His mother's laughter as she kneaded bread in the kitchen, the sound of his sisters singing while they worked in the garden, his father's steady presence, teaching him to read by lamplight. All of it lost now, his parents dead from fever, his sisters married and moved away, the farm sold to pay debts. The memories came to him most strongly at night, when the coyotes howled in the distance and the wind rattled the shutters. He'd left Missouri to escape those ghosts, but they'd followed him across the plains, settling into the corners of his cabin like dust that couldn't be swept away. One evening, after a particularly brutal day spent searching for stranded calves in a sudden blizzard, Jacob sat at his table with a sheet of paper before him. His hands, more accustomed to rope and leather than pen and ink, trembled slightly as he began to write. "To whom it may concern," he started, then crossed it out. Too formal. He tried again. "I am looking for a wife." Too blunt. Finally, after several attempts, he managed to compose a letter that captured something of his situation without sounding entirely desperate. He described his ranch, being honest about its isolation and the hard work required to maintain it. He mentioned his cabin, promising to add improvements for a woman's comfort. He wrote of the mountains visible from his porch, the creek that ran clear and cold through the northern pasture, the wild roses that bloomed along its banks in spring. He didn't mention the loneliness that pressed against his ribs like a physical ache, or the way he sometimes forgot the sound of his own name because no one ever spoke it. The marriage broker's response arrived 6 weeks later, delivered by the mail coach that passed through once a month. Jacob's hands shook as he opened the envelope, scanning the formal language that outlined terms and fees. Included was a tintype photograph of a woman with dark hair pulled back severely from a thin face. Her expression was solemn, almost grim, but something in her eyes, a directness, a strength, made him look twice. Her name was Ruth Harper. The letter explained, a widow from Pennsylvania with 2 young children. She was seeking a new situation in the West, willing to work hard in exchange for a stable home. The broker emphasized her domestic skills, her experience with farm life, her good moral character. What the letter didn't say, but what Jacob read between the lines, was that she was desperate too. He studied the photograph in the lamplight, trying to imagine this stern-faced woman in his cabin, her children playing in the yard where now only chickens scratched in the dust. The thought both thrilled and terrified him. What if she hated the isolation? What if the children found him frightening? What if he'd forgotten how to be gentle, how to speak softly, how to share his space with others? But stronger than the fear was the pull of possibility. He thought of voices filling the cabin, of cooking for more than one, of having someone to share the burden when the storms came and the cattle needed tending. He thought of teaching the children to ride, of perhaps hearing laughter again. Jacob spent the next weeks preparing with a nervous energy he hadn't felt in years. He repaired the loose boards in the cabin floor, built a partition to create a separate sleeping area, constructed 2 small beds from pine planks. He whitewashed the walls and built shelves for dishes he didn't yet own. In town, he endured Pete's knowing looks as he purchased fabric for curtains, a proper cook stove to replace his campfire arrangement, and even a small mirror, the first the cabin had ever seen. The horse barn received attention too. He mucked out stalls that had stood empty, repaired the gaps in the walls where wind whistled through, laid fresh straw. He built a chicken coop with a proper door, thinking the children might enjoy gathering eggs. Every improvement was an act of hope, a prayer to a future he could barely imagine. As autumn progressed and the aspens on the distant mountains turned gold, Jacob found himself walking to the edge of his property each evening, looking east toward the road that led to town. Soon, the letter had promised. Soon his bride would arrive on the stage from Cheyenne, bringing with her those 2 small souls he'd pledged to shelter, standing there in the gathering dusk, with the first stars appearing in the vast sky. Jacob allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loneliness one last time. He'd built his life around self-reliance, around needing no one and being needed by none. Now he was about to gamble it all on a woman he'd never met, children he'd never seen, a future as uncertain as the weather that swept across these plains. But as he turned back toward his cabin, their cabin, he corrected himself. He felt something loosen in his chest. The lamplight glowing in the window looked warmer somehow, more welcoming. The empty chairs around his table seemed to wait with patient promise. Whatever came next, whatever challenges this Ruth Harper and her children might bring, it had to be better than this echoing silence, this life measured out in solitary meals and wordless days. Jacob McAllister, lonely rancher of the Wyoming Territory, had bought himself a wife. Now all that remained was to see if he could build a family. The stagecoach appeared as a dark speck on the horizon, growing larger as it wound its way along the dusty trail that connected Cheyenne to the scattered settlements beyond. Jacob had been waiting since dawn, having changed his shirt twice and shaved with unusual care. His horse, Duke, stood patiently tied to the post outside Murphy's general store, occasionally stamping against the flies that buzzed in the October heat. As the coach drew nearer, Jacob could make out the driver perched high on his seat, the shotgun rider beside him, and the cloud of dust that marked their passage across the dry plains. His mouth went dry, and he found himself wiping his palms on his trousers like a green boy at his first dance. The coach pulled up with a groan of wood and leather, horses snorting and shaking their heads. The driver, a grizzled man named Hawkins, whom Jacob knew by sight, called out, "Got your delivery, McAllister, all the way from Pennsylvania." The door opened, and a small boy tumbled out first, perhaps 6 years old. with sandy hair that stuck up at odd angles and clothes that had seen better days. He landed in the dust and immediately turned to help someone else descend. A girl followed, older than the boy by maybe 2 years, her dark hair braided tightly, her small face pinched with wariness. Then came their mother. Ruth Harper was nothing like the tintype had suggested. The photograph had shown a grim woman, all sharp angles and severity. But the person who stepped down from the coach moved with a quiet grace, despite her obvious exhaustion. Her traveling dress, once black, had faded to a dusty gray, and the hem was torn in places. Her dark hair, though pulled back in a simple bun, had loosened during the journey, leaving wisps to frame a face that was thin but not harsh. There were lines around her eyes, from squinting into sun or from sorrow. Jacob couldn't tell, but those eyes themselves were remarkable, gray as winter sky. They took in everything at once, the shabby storefront, the handful of curious townsfolk who had gathered to gawk, and finally, Jacob himself. She didn't smile. Instead, she gathered her children close with a gesture that was both protective and preparatory, as if steeling them all for whatever came next. The boy pressed against her skirts while the girl stood straighter, chin lifted in a way that reminded Jacob of her mother. "Mrs. Harper?" Jacob stepped forward, removing his hat. His voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by nervousness. "Mr. McAllister." It wasn't a question. She studied him with those direct eyes, taking in his clean shirt, his calloused hands, the awkward way he held his hat. "These are my children. Thomas." She placed a hand on the boy's head. "And Mary." The boy, Thomas, peered up at Jacob with open curiosity, but Mary kept her gaze fixed somewhere past his shoulder, as if she could will herself elsewhere through sheer determination. "Pleased to meet you both," Jacob said, attempting what he hoped was a welcoming smile. Thomas ducked his head, but Mary's expression didn't change. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. The townsfolk continued to stare, and Jacob could practically hear the gossip already spreading. The rancher who bought himself a wife, the desperate widow who sold herself west. He saw Ruth's jaw tighten as she registered the scrutiny. "My wagon's just there." Jacob gestured, desperate to escape the public spectacle. "It's a fair ride to the ranch, 3 hours, maybe 4 with the roads as they are." Ruth nodded and began directing the unloading of their possessions. There wasn't much, a single trunk, 2 carpet bags, and a small crate that Thomas insisted on carrying himself. Jacob moved to help, hefting the trunk easily despite its weight. As he loaded it onto the wagon bed, he caught the scent of lavender, faint but distinct, rising from the worn leather. It was such an unexpectedly gentle smell that he paused, remembering suddenly that this trunk contained all that remained of another life, another home. Once everything was secured. Jacob helped Ruth climb onto the wagon seat. Her hand in his was work-roughened but smaller than he'd expected, and she withdrew it as soon as she was settled. The children clambered into the back among the supplies he'd bought in town: flour, coffee, a length of bright calico he'd impulsively purchased, thinking Mary might like a new dress. As they pulled away from town, Ruth sat rigidly upright, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look back, though Jacob noticed Thomas twisting around for one last glimpse of the coach that had brought them. Mary had found the calico and was fingering it with an expression that might have been interest or suspicion. The first hour passed in near silence. Jacob tried twice to make conversation, commenting on the weather and pointing out landmarks, but Ruth's responses were brief to the point of curtness. He subsided, concentrating on navigating the rutted trail while stealing glances at this stranger who was now, in the eyes of the law and God, his wife. It was Thomas who finally broke the silence. "Mister, is that your horse back there following us?" Jacob looked back to see Duke trotting along behind the wagon, reins dragging. In his nervousness, he'd forgotten to tie the horse to the back. "That's Duke," he said. "Guess he didn't want to be left behind." "Can I ride him?" The boy's voice was hopeful. "Thomas." Ruth's tone carried a warning. "Don't be forward." "He's no trouble," Jacob said quickly. "Maybe when we get to the ranch, if your ma agrees." Ruth turned to look at him then. Really look at him. And he saw something shift in her expression. Not softening exactly, but a recognition perhaps that he was trying. "We'll see," she said, which earned a small cheer from Thomas. The sun climbed higher, and the October heat grew oppressive. Jacob noticed Ruth dabbing at her forehead with a handkerchief and wished he'd thought to bring water. The children had grown quiet in the back, and when he glanced over his shoulder, he saw Mary had fashioned a shade for her brother from the calico cloth. "It's not much further," he said. "There's a creek runs through the north pasture. Water's good and cold. The children are used to hardship," Ruth said, and something in her tone suggested she was speaking to herself as much as to him. "We've managed worse than a hot day." He wanted to ask about that, about what had brought her to this point, what trials had carved those lines around her eyes, but sensed this wasn't the time. Instead, he said, "The cabin's small, but I've made some improvements. Built beds for the children, put up a partition for privacy. There's a good stove now, not just the fireplace." She nodded, still looking straight ahead. Then, as if the words were pulled from her against her will, she asked, "Are there neighbors?" "Closest is the Andersons, about 5 miles north. They run sheep, good people, though I don't see them often. Town's a half-day's ride when the weather's good. And when it's not," he hesitated, "sometimes in winter, the snow drifts too deep for travel. We might be cut off for weeks at a time." She absorbed this information without comment, but he saw her arms draw the children imperceptibly closer. They topped a rise, and the ranch spread out before them. Jacob felt the familiar mixture of pride and apology as he surveyed his holdings. The cabin looked especially small from this distance, a weathered box against the vastness of the plains. The barn stood slightly askew. He'd never gotten around to fixing the lean, and the new chicken coop looked almost absurdly optimistic with its fresh lumber. "There it is," he said unnecessarily. Ruth straightened, taking in every detail. The children peered around her, and he heard Mary whisper something to her brother. Thomas's response was clearer. "But where's everything else?" Jacob's chest tightened. Of course, they'd come from Pennsylvania, from a proper town with proper houses and shops and schools. This emptiness must seem like the end of the world to them. As they descended toward the ranch, Ruth spoke again, her voice carrying a different quality now, harder, more decisive. "Mr. McAllister, I need to make something clear before we go any further." He slowed the horses, turning to face her. She looked him directly in the eyes, her own gaze unwavering. "I've come here out of necessity, as I'm sure you've gathered. My children have lost their father, their home, everything familiar. They've endured things children shouldn't have to endure." Her voice caught slightly, but she pressed on. "I'll work hard. I'll keep your house, tend your garden if there is one, help with the stock if needed. I'll be a wife to you in every way that's proper. But I need your word on something first." Jacob waited, hardly breathing. Ruth placed a hand on each child's shoulder, drawing them against her. "These are my children, mine. If I enter that cabin, if we make this arrangement permanent, it must be with the understanding that you'll treat them as yours. Not as burdens or outsiders, but as your own. They must have your protection, your provision, your—" She paused, searching for the word. "Your kindness. Without that promise, I'll take them back on that stage, empty-handed or not." The words hung in the air between them. Jacob looked at the small faces, Thomas's wide-eyed hope, Mary's defensive wariness, and then back at their mother, who waited with a stillness that suggested everything hung on his response. "Mrs. Harper," he said slowly. "Ruth, I'm not a man of many words or fine speeches, but I give you my word. Your children will be my children. This home, such as it is, will be their home. I'll do my best by them, as God is my witness." She studied him for a long moment more, as if she could read the truth of his promise in his weathered face. Then she nodded once, decisively. "Then we'll enter your cabin, Mr. McAllister, and see what kind of life we can build from this beginning." As they rode the final distance to the ranch house, Jacob felt the weight of her words and his promise settle onto his shoulders. Behind them, young Thomas was already chattering about Duke and chickens and whether there might be rabbits to chase. Mary remained silent, but he caught her eyeing the vast sky with something that might have been wonder. And beside him, Ruth Harper, now Ruth McAllister, sat with her hands folded and her face set toward whatever future awaited them in that small cabin on the endless plains. The first week passed in a careful dance of adjustment and avoidance. Ruth threw herself into transforming the cabin with a fierce energy that suggested she was trying to outrun something, perhaps the reality of what she'd done, or perhaps simply the awkwardness of sharing space with a stranger. She scrubbed every surface until the old wood gleamed, arranged and rearranged their few possessions, and hung the new calico curtains with a precision that spoke of a need for control in a situation where she had very little. The children moved through the cabin like small ghosts, careful not to disturb anything. Thomas would start to run, remember himself, and slow to a walk. Mary helped her mother without being asked, her movements eerily adult for a child of 8. They ate at Jacob's table in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin plates and the pop of wood in the fireplace. Jacob found himself retreating to the barn more often than necessary. The animals, at least, were familiar companions who expected nothing from him but feed and water. He would catch himself standing in the doorway, watching Ruth work through the window, wanting to go in but not knowing what he'd say once he did. The easy solitude he'd known for so long had become something else, a self-imposed exile from his own home. It was the chickens that finally broke the stalemate. On the 4th morning, Jacob was heading to the barn when he heard a commotion from the new coop. Thomas had somehow gotten inside and was being chased in circles by a particularly aggressive hen while Mary stood outside, hands pressed to her mouth, caught between alarm and laughter. "She's pecking me!" Thomas shrieked, running in circles while the hen pursued him with single-minded determination. Without thinking, Jacob vaulted the fence and scooped up the boy, lifting him out of reach of the indignant bird. Thomas clung to him instinctively, his small body trembling with leftover fear and excitement. "That's Bessie," Jacob said, setting the boy on the fence rail. "She's protecting her nest. See there? She's got eggs she's sitting on." "Will they be baby chickens?" Thomas asked, fear forgotten in curiosity. "In about 2 weeks, if we're lucky." Mary had crept closer, drawn by the conversation. "How can you tell?" Jacob found himself explaining about brooding hens and counting days, about how to check if an egg was fertilizing without disturbing it too much. The children listened with rapt attention, and when Ruth appeared in the doorway to call them for breakfast, she found all 3 of them leaning over the fence, heads together, studying the irritable Bessie. Something in her face softened at the sight. "Breakfast is ready," she said quietly, and Jacob thought he heard a different note in her voice. Not quite warmth, but perhaps the possibility of it. That small moment by the chicken coop shifted something in the household's rhythm. Thomas began following Jacob around during his chores, peppering him with questions. "Why do you brand the cattle? Does it hurt them? How can you tell which cow is which?" "Can I learn to rope?" Jacob answered patiently, finding that he enjoyed teaching someone so eager to learn. He showed Thomas how to scatter corn for the chickens without getting pecked, how to check the horse's hooves for stones, how to mend a fence rail. The boy soaked it all up like drought-struck earth absorbing rain. Mary remained more reserved, but Jacob noticed her watching from the porch when he worked with Thomas. One afternoon, he found her trying to lift a water bucket that was clearly too heavy for her. "Here," he said, taking it from her hands. "Let me show you a trick." He demonstrated how to fill it only halfway and make 2 trips instead of 1. Sometimes the easy way is the smart way. She nodded solemnly, then surprised him by saying, "Papa used to say that too." It was the first time either child had mentioned their father. As October wore on toward November, The first cold winds began to blow down from the mountains. Jacob spent his days preparing for winter, bringing the cattle closer to home, patching holes in the barn, chopping seemingly endless supplies of wood. Ruth worked alongside him when she could, proving herself handy with an axe and unafraid of hard labor. But despite these small progressions, a careful distance remained between them. They were polite strangers sharing a roof. Nothing more. At night, Ruth would retreat with the children behind the partition he'd built, and Jacob would lie on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the murmur of her voice as she told them bedtime stories. The first real test came with a Sunday visit to town. Jacob had put it off as long as possible, but they needed supplies. And Ruth had quietly mentioned that the children should be enrolled in the school. The ride to town was different from that first journey. Thomas chattered freely now, and even Mary occasionally added an observation about the landscape. But as they neared the settlement, Jacob saw Ruth's shoulders tense. His concerns proved justified. The moment they entered Murphy's store, conversation stopped. Women who'd been gossiping near the fabric counter turned to stare openly. Men by the pickle barrel exchanged knowing looks. Mrs. McAllister. Old Pete Murphy greeted Ruth with exaggerated courtesy that somehow sounded like mockery. "How are you finding our frontier life?" "Very well, thank you." Ruth replied evenly, but Jacob saw the slight tremor in her hands as she examined a bolt of cloth. The whispers followed them through town. "Mail order, bride," he heard someone mutter. "Bought and paid for," said another. "Those poor children." At the schoolhouse, Miss Patricia Downing, the schoolmarm, looked at Mary and Thomas as if they were specimens in a jar. "Of course we'll take them," she said to Ruth, managing to make even this simple statement sound like condescension. "Though they'll likely be behind our standards here." Mary's chin lifted at that, and she spoke for the first time. "I can read and cipher. I help teach the younger ones back home." Miss Downing's smile was thin. "We'll see about that, dear." The ride home was silent. Thomas had retreated into himself, and Mary stared fixedly at her hands. Ruth sat like a statue, but Jacob could feel the hurt radiating from her like heat from a stove. That night, after the children were in bed, Jacob found Ruth crying silently by the dying fire. She startled when she saw him, hastily wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not usually given to such displays. You've nothing to apologize for." He sat carefully in the chair across from her. Townfolk can be cruel when they don't understand something. "They understand perfectly," Ruth said bitterly. "A desperate widow who sold herself. A man who had to buy companionship. What else would they think?" Jacob was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "What they think doesn't keep our roof from leaking or our cattle from needing tending. It doesn't teach Thomas to ride or help Mary with her letters." She looked at him then. Really looked at him. Perhaps for the first time since that moment on the wagon. "Why did you do it? Really? You could have continued on alone." He considered lying, giving her some noble reason that would make them both feel better. But something in her direct gaze demanded truth. "Because the silence was killing me," he said simply. "Because I'd forgotten the sound of my own voice. Because I wanted—" He paused, struggling. "I wanted to matter to someone again." Ruth's expression softened. "I understand that," she whispered. "After James died, after we lost the farm, I felt like I was disappearing, like I could fade away entirely and no one would notice except the children." "You matter here," Jacob said firmly. "All of you. This place. It's already different with you in it. Better." She gave him a small, sad smile. "Even if the whole town thinks we're a scandal? Especially then." He stood, suddenly awkward again. "Those people in town, they don't see what I see. They don't see how hard you work, how you've made this cabin into something resembling a home. They don't see Mary helping you with dinner or Thomas gathering eggs without being asked. They don't see a family being built, slow and careful, like a house going up board by board." Ruth's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Is that what we're building? A family?" "I'd like to think so," Jacob said quietly. If you're willing. She nodded slowly, then stood as well. I should check on the children. As she passed him, she paused, placing a hand briefly on his arm. Thank you, Jacob, for what you said, for trying. After she disappeared behind the partition, Jacob stood alone by the fireplace, feeling the ghost of her touch on his arm. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, but inside the cabin felt warmer somehow. Not quite a home yet, perhaps, but no longer just a shelter either. That night, he heard Thomas crying, a nightmare, most likely. He listened as Ruth soothed the boy, her voice a soft murmur through the thin partition. Then, surprisingly, he heard Mary's voice join her mother's, singing a lullaby he didn't recognize. Jacob closed his eyes, letting the sounds wash over him. A woman's voice, children's voices, filling the spaces that had been empty for so long. They weren't quite a family yet, these four souls brought together by necessity and loneliness. But perhaps, with time and patience and small acts of kindness, they could become one. The first drops of rain began to fall, drumming on the roof. Winter was coming, with all its challenges. But for the first time in years, Jacob McAllister wouldn't face it alone. The drought came early that year, settling over the Wyoming territory like a curse. By mid-November, when there should have been snow on the mountains, the peaks remained bare and brown. The creek that ran through Jacob's north pasture slowed to a trickle, then dried completely, leaving only cracked mud and the bleached bones of fish. Jacob stood at the edge of what had been a watering hole, Duke beside him, both studying the devastation. The cattle had gathered nearby, lowing plaintively, their ribs beginning to show through their hides. He'd already lost 3 head, found them dead near the southern fence line where they'd wandered seeking water. How bad is it? Ruth's voice came from behind him. She'd taken to joining him on these morning surveys, leaving the children to finish their breakfast. Bad enough. He didn't try to soften it. She deserved the truth. If we don't get rain or snow soon, we'll have to start selling off cattle at whatever price we can get. And even then, he didn't finish, but she understood. Even then, they might not make it through winter. They walked back toward the cabin in silence, the dust rising with each step. The landscape that had seemed merely harsh when she arrived now looked actively hostile. Brown grass crackling underfoot, scattered cattle bones from previous years bleaching in the sun like warnings. Thomas asked me yesterday if the chickens were going to die, Ruth said quietly. I didn't know what to tell him. We'll haul water from the Anderson place if we have to. They've got a deeper well that hasn't run dry yet. Jacob paused. Sam Anderson offered to help, said we could work out payment later. Ruth's jaw tightened at the word payment. They both knew what that meant. Debt, obligation. The slow slide toward losing everything. She'd traveled this road before, after her first husband died, that afternoon, while helping Ruth with the washing, using carefully rationed water heated over the fire. Jacob noticed her favoring her left hand. Let me see, he said, reaching for her arm. She pulled back instinctively. It's nothing, a splinter from the washboard. Ruth. He kept his voice gentle but firm. Please. Reluctantly, she extended her hand. The splinter was deep, the skin around it red and swollen. As he carefully extracted it with his knife point, he was struck by how small her hand looked in his, how the calluses couldn't hide its essential delicacy. There, he said, releasing her. You should put some salve on that. Thank you. She cradled her hand against her chest, and something in the gesture, protective, vulnerable, made his chest tighten. That evening brought an unexpected cold snap. The temperature plummeted, and a bitter wind swept down from the mountains. The children huddled near the fireplace while Jacob brought in extra wood. Tell us about Pennsylvania. Thomas begged his mother. About the snow there. Ruth smiled, settling into her chair with her mending. Well, the snow would pile up so high sometimes that it covered the first-floor windows. Your father would have to dig a tunnel just to get to the barn. Papa was strong, Mary added quietly. He could lift a whole bale of hay by himself. It was the most either child had said about their father. Jacob, adding another log to the fire, kept his movements quiet, not wanting to interrupt. Yes, he was strong, Ruth agreed. But he was gentle too. He carved those wooden animals you play with. Thomas, the horse, and the cow. I remember, Thomas said. He was making a dog when he got sick. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken grief. Jacob cleared his throat. I could try finishing it. He offered. I'm fair with a knife. Not artistic, maybe, but... Thomas's face lit up. Really? If your mother still has the piece. Ruth looked at him for a long moment, then rose and went to her trunk. She returned with a small block of half-carved wood. I couldn't bear to throw it away, she said softly, handing it to him. Jacob studied the partially formed shape. He could see where it was meant to go, the beginning of legs, the suggestion of a tail. I'll do my best, he promised. 3 days later, disaster struck. Jacob was in the far pasture, trying to move the cattle closer to home. When he spotted the strays, 5 head had broken through a weak section of fence, driven by thirst toward what they must have sensed was water somewhere beyond his property line. He spurred Duke forward, but the cattle, maddened by thirst, scattered in different directions. He chose the largest group, 3 head, and gave chase. The ground here was treacherous, full of hidden rocks and sudden drops. He should have been more careful. Duke caught his hoof in a prairie dog hole at full gallop. The horse went down hard, and Jacob had just enough time to kick free of the stirrups before he hit the ground. Pain exploded through his left shoulder as he landed, and he felt something give way with a wet pop. Duke struggled to his feet, favoring his right foreleg, but apparently not seriously hurt. Jacob wasn't so lucky. When he tried to rise, the pain in his shoulder sent him back to his knees. Gasping, his left arm hung useless at his side. The cattle were long gone. Using his good arm, Jacob managed to grab Duke's reins. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of pain and determination. By the time he made it to the yard, the sun was low on the horizon, and he was swaying in the saddle. Ruth appeared in the doorway, took one look at him, and ran forward. "Mary, get water heating," she called over her shoulder. "Thomas, run to the barn for the medical supplies." Together, she and Mary helped him inside. Ruth's hands were gentle but efficient as she examined his shoulder. "It's dislocated," she said. "I've seen this before. I can set it, but—" "Do it," Jacob gritted out. She positioned herself behind him, gripping his arm. "This will hurt." Can't hurt worse than—" The rest of his words were lost in a cry of pain as she pulled and rotated in one smooth motion. There was another pop, and suddenly his arm was back where it belonged, though the pain remained fierce. Ruth wrapped his shoulder tightly, fashioning a sling from a torn sheet. Her face was set in concentration, a small line appearing between her eyebrows. This close, he could smell the lavender soap she used, see the way the firelight caught the threads of silver in her dark hair. "You're lucky," she said, sitting back. "It went back in cleanly, but you'll need to rest it for weeks." "Can't," he said. "The cattle, we already lost those 5 head. The others need tending, water hauling." "Then you'll have to teach me." He looked at her in surprise. "Ruth, you can't—" "Can't what? Work cattle? Haul water? I'm stronger than I look. Jacob McAllister. And unless you have a better solution, you'll have to trust me." Over the following days, Ruth proved as good as her word. She rose before dawn to help with the feeding, learned to handle a rope with surprising skill, and drove the wagon to the Anderson place for water while Jacob, frustrated by his uselessness, supervised from the porch. The children pitched in too. Thomas took over the chicken care completely, while Mary helped her mother with the heavier household tasks. Watching them work together, Jacob felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with his injury. One evening, as Ruth was changing his bandages, Thomas appeared at his elbow. "I've been practicing," the boy said shyly, producing a length of rope. "Want to see?" What followed was a clumsy but earnest demonstration of the basic knots Jacob had shown him weeks ago, when Thomas managed a passable bowline. Jacob felt an unexpected surge of pride. "Well done," he said. "You'll be a proper rancher before you know it." Thomas beamed. "When your shoulder's better, will you teach me to ride Duke? I mean, really ride, not just sit there." Jacob glanced at Ruth, who gave a small nod. "I'd be honored to," he said. That night, as Ruth helped him settle into bed, he'd given up pretending he could manage alone. She paused at the partition. "The children are starting to call you Pa," she said quietly. "Not to your face yet, but between themselves. Is that acceptable to you?" Jacob's throat felt suddenly tight. "More than acceptable," he managed. She nodded and turned to go, then looked back. "You kept your promise," she said, "about treating them as your own. Even hurt, even with everything falling apart around us, you've been—" She paused, searching for words. "You've been the father they needed." After she'd gone, Jacob lay in the darkness, his shoulder throbbing but his heart oddly light. Outside, the wind howled across the dry land, rattling the windows and reminding him of all the challenges still to come. The drought, the lost cattle, the crushing weight of trying to keep them all alive through winter. But inside the cabin, he could hear the quiet sounds of his family, Ruth humming as she banked the fire, Thomas whispering something to his sister, Mary's soft giggle in response. His family. The words still felt new, fragile as spring ice, but real. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, wounded shoulder and all, Jacob McAllister felt richer than he'd ever been in his life. The trouble with Elijah Thornton had been brewing like a storm on the horizon. Jacob's neighbor to the east had always been a difficult man, quick to take offense, slow to forget a grievance. But lately, something darker had taken root in him. Perhaps it was the drought that had driven him to desperation. Or perhaps it was simply the sight of Ruth that had awakened something covetous in his nature. It started with small things. Thornton's cattle began appearing on Jacob's land more frequently, always near the few remaining water sources. When Jacob, still nursing his injured shoulder, sent Thomas to politely drive them back, Thornton claimed the boy had spooked them deliberately, causing a pregnant cow to lose her calf. "That's a lie," Thomas said fiercely when he returned home, his young face flushed with indignation. "I was gentle as could be. That cow wasn't even showing yet." Ruth placed a calming hand on her son's shoulder, but Jacob saw the worry in her eyes. They both knew Thornton's reputation for holding grudges. The next incident was more serious. Ruth had taken the wagon to town for supplies, the children with her, when Thornton intercepted them on the road. Mary later recounted the encounter in a trembling voice. "He blocked the road with his horse," she said, pressed close to her mother's side. "He said things about Mama, about how she deserved better than a broken-down rancher who couldn't even protect his own land." "What did your mother do?" Jacob asked, though he could guess. Ruth's spine was steel when it came to protecting her children. She told him to move aside. Thomas piped up, a note of pride in his voice. And when he didn't, she drove the wagon right at him. He had to jump clear or get run down. Ruth remained silent through her children's telling, but Jacob noticed the white-knuckled grip she maintained on her coffee cup. When the children had gone to bed, she finally spoke. "He said other things I won't repeat." Her voice was steady, but he caught the tremor underneath. "About you, about our arrangement, about what kind of woman sells herself to a stranger." Jacob's good hand clenched into a fist. "I'll have words with him." "No." Ruth looked at him directly. "That's what he wants. An excuse to escalate things. We can't afford trouble, Jacob. Not with winter coming and the ranch already struggling." She was right, of course. But the thought of Thornton speaking to her that way, frightening the children, made something hot and protective flare in his chest. The harassment continued. Fences were cut in the night, allowing what remained of Jacob's herd to scatter. The chicken coop was vandalized, though thankfully the birds survived. One morning, they woke to find obscene words painted on the barn wall, positioned where the children would see them on their way to gather eggs. Ruth scrubbed at the paint with lye soap and determination, her face set in hard lines. When Jacob tried to help, one-handed and clumsy, she waved him off. "Save your strength," she said. "We'll need it." The breaking point came on a cold December morning. Snow had finally begun to fall, a blessed relief after months of drought. But it brought new dangers. Jacob was in the barn, awkwardly trying to milk their cow one-handed, when he heard Mary scream. He ran outside to find Thornton in their yard, holding Duke's reins. The horse was saddled, packs tied behind. Thornton had clearly been planning to steal him, but it was the sight of Mary, sprawled in the snow where she'd been pushed, that sent rage flooding through Jacob's veins. "Get off my land," he said, his voice deadly quiet. Thornton sneered. "Your land? For how much longer? McAllister, you can't work it with that busted wing. Can't protect it. Can't even keep your bought woman's brats from getting underfoot." Ruth appeared in the doorway, Thomas beside her. Her face went white when she saw Mary in the snow, then darkened with a fury Jacob had never seen before. "Don't!" Jacob said sharply as she started forward. "To Thornton," he repeated. "Get off my land, now!" "Or what? You'll fight me one-handed." Thornton laughed, an ugly sound. "I think not, but I'll make you a deal. McAllister, you're going to lose this place come spring anyway. Why not sell it to me now? I'll give you enough to get your little family back east where they belong." "This is where we belong," Ruth said, helping Mary to her feet. The girl clung to her mother, tears streaming down her face, but her chin was lifted in that familiar gesture of defiance. Thornton's eyes lingered on Ruth in a way that made Jacob's skin crawl. "You sure about that, ma'am? Winter's hard out here, harder still when accidents happen. Barns catch fire, cattle sicken and die, children wander off in snowstorms." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Jacob stepped forward, ignoring the protest from his shoulder. "You threatening my family, Thornton? Just observing how dangerous frontier life can be." Thornton's smile was cold. "A woman like that, she deserves better than watching her children suffer. I could make sure they don't, could make sure she's comfortable." What happened next surprised everyone, including Jacob. Ruth strode forward, snatched Duke's reins from Thornton's hand, and slapped the man across the face with them. The leather left a red welt across his cheek. "You listen to me, you pathetic excuse for a man," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You come near my children again, you so much as look at this ranch, and I'll put a bullet in you myself. I've skinned rabbits with more backbone than you. Now get out before I decide you're worth the price of ammunition." For a moment, Thornton stood frozen, hand to his cheek, shock written across his features. Then his face darkened. "You'll regret that, woman. You all will." He stalked to his own horse and mounted. As he turned to leave, he called back, "This isn't over, McAllister, not by a long shot." After he'd gone, Ruth's brave facade crumbled. She sank onto the porch step, gathering Mary into her arms, her whole body trembling. Thomas pressed against her other side, his young face pale but determined. Jacob knelt awkwardly beside them, his good arm encompassing all three. "He won't hurt you," he said fiercely. "Any of you, I swear it." "How?" Ruth's voice was small, stripped of its earlier bravado. "How can you stop him? You're hurt. We're outnumbered. And he's right. The law won't care about threats to a mail-order bride and her children." Jacob was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, "The Andersons. Sam's a good man, and he's no friend of Thornton's. The Millers, too, and the Clearys. They're decent folk. They just need to know what's happening." "They won't care," Ruth said bitterly. "We're outsiders. I'm the woman who sold herself, remember? You're the woman who works herself to the bone keeping this ranch running." Jacob countered. "Who helped bring in Amy Anderson's harvest when Sam broke his leg last year? Who sent soup when the Miller children were sick? They know that, even if they've been too proud or too proper to show it." That evening, despite Ruth's protests, Jacob rode to the Anderson ranch. His shoulders screamed with every jolt, but he gritted his teeth and endured. Sam Anderson listened in growing anger as Jacob laid out Thornton's escalating harassment. "The man's gone too far. Sam said when Jacob finished. "Threatening children? That's not the Western way. Drought or no drought." Word spread quickly through the scattered community. By the next morning, riders began appearing at Jacob's ranch. Sam Anderson and his eldest son, the Miller brothers, even old Tobias Cleary with his ancient rifle. They came quietly, without fanfare, but their message was clear. When Thornton appeared that afternoon, clearly intending more mischief, he found a dozen armed men waiting. Jacob stood at the front, his arm still in a sling but his stance steady. "Seems you've been making threats against this family," Sam Anderson said conversationally. "We don't hold with that around here." Thornton's face went red, then white. "This is none of your business. Anderson, threatening women and children, that's everybody's business." Old Cleary spat tobacco juice near Thornton's horse's hooves. "You got a problem with McAllister, you settle it like a man, but you leave his family out of it, or you'll answer to all of us." The standoff stretched taut as wire. Finally, Thornton wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he snarled, but the words lacked their earlier venom. "Yes, it is," Sam Anderson said firmly. "You so much as sneeze in this family's direction, and we'll run you out of the territory. That's a promise." "Thornton." After Thornton had ridden off and the neighbors had departed with nods and quiet words of support, Jacob found Ruth in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face as she peeled potatoes for dinner. "What's wrong?" he asked, alarmed. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, wiping her eyes with her apron. "They came," she whispered. "All of them." "For us. I thought we were alone out here, but they came." Jacob moved closer, tentatively placing his good hand over hers. "You're not alone. Ruth, none of us are. That's what I've been trying to tell you. We're building something here, not just a ranch, but a place in this community. A home." She looked up at him, and something shifted in her expression. Before he could react, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips softly to his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for keeping your promise, for protecting us." As she turned back to her potatoes, Jacob stood frozen, his cheek burning where her lips had touched. Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing the drought-scarred land in pristine white. It felt like a new beginning, a promise that the hard times would pass. Thornton would likely cause more trouble. Men like him always did. But Jacob no longer faced him alone. He had Ruth, steady and fierce. He had the children, brave and resilient. And he had neighbors who'd proven that community meant something out here on the frontier. They would survive this winter. Together. The rains came 3 days before Christmas, starting as a gentle patter on the roof and building to a steady downpour that lasted through the night. Jacob woke to the sound of water rushing through the creek bed that had been dry for months, a sound so unexpected and welcome that he initially thought he was dreaming. Ruth was already at the window, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. "Listen," she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might frighten the rain away. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the parched earth drink deeply. The drought hadn't broken. It would take much more than one storm for that, but this was hope made tangible, falling from the sky in silver sheets. "Ma! Pa!" Thomas burst from behind the partition, his hair sticking up at wild angles. "The creek's running! I can hear it! Pa!" The boy had said it naturally, without thought, and Jacob felt that now familiar warmth bloom in his chest. Ruth glanced at him, a small smile playing at her lips. "Get dressed," she told Thomas. "We'll need to check the animals, make sure they're sheltered properly." What followed was organized chaos. The barn, which they'd thought sound enough, had developed several leaks. Jacob and Thomas worked to move the feed to drier ground, while Ruth and Mary led the horses to the most protected stalls. The chickens, miserable and bedraggled, huddled together complaining loudly about the indignity of wet feathers. It was while they were securing a loose barn door that disaster struck again. The wind, which had been building steadily, suddenly gusted with tremendous force. The door, caught like a sail, was ripped from Jacob's one-handed grip. The edge of it caught him across the temple as it swung, sending him stumbling backward into the barn wall. When his vision cleared, he was on the ground with 3 worried faces hovering over him. Blood ran warm down the side of his face, and his shoulder, the same one he'd injured weeks before, throbbed with renewed agony. "Don't move," Ruth commanded, her hands already examining the cut on his head. "Thomas, get the medical supplies. Mary, heat water, now!" As the children ran to obey, Ruth helped him sit up against the wall. The barn spun lazily around him, and he had to close his eyes against a wave of nausea. "I'm fine," he managed. "You're not," Ruth said sharply, but her touch remained gentle as she pressed a fold of her skirt against the bleeding cut. "You're trying to do too much with that shoulder still healing. This has to stop. Jacob." He opened his eyes to find her face inches from his, her gray eyes dark with worry. And something else, something that looked like anger. "You think you have to do everything yourself," she continued, her voice low and fierce. "You think asking for help makes you weak. But what happens to us if you kill yourself trying to prove you're strong? What happens to the children?" "Ruth, no," she cut him off. "You listen to me. Jacob McAllister. We're partners in this, or we're nothing. That means you trust me to carry my share of the load. It means you rest when you need to rest. It means—" her voice cracked. "It means you stop acting like you're still alone." The truth of her words hit harder than the barn door had. He reached up with his good hand, covering hers where it pressed against his wound. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Old habits. Then learn new ones," she said, but her tone had softened. "We need you whole, not heroic." By the time they got him back to the cabin, cleaned and bandaged, the storm had intensified into something monstrous. The wind howled like a living thing, driving rain horizontal. The cabin creaked and groaned under the assault, and water began seeping under the door despite their efforts to block it. They worked through the day to protect what they could. Precious flour and cornmeal were moved to the highest shelves. The new calico fabric, meant for Christmas dresses, was wrapped in oilcloth. The children's school books were stacked safely on the bed. As night fell, the situation worsened. The creek, so welcome that morning, had swollen beyond its banks. Jacob could hear it roaring in the darkness, far louder and closer than it should be. "We need to move the livestock to higher ground," he said, struggling to rise from his chair. Ruth pushed him back down firmly. "We need to do nothing. I'll go." "In this storm? Absolutely not." They glared at each other, 2 stubborn wills colliding. It was Mary who broke the stalemate. "We could all go," she said quietly. "Together, like when we fixed the barn." Jacob and Ruth turned to look at her, this quiet child who so rarely asserted herself. "If we're partners," Mary continued, her chin lifting in that gesture so like her mother's. "Then we work together. All of us." Ruth's expression softened. "Out of the mouths of babes," she murmured. "To Jacob," she said. "She's right. We do this as a family. Or not at all." And so they did, wrapped in every piece of oilcloth and canvas they owned. The 4 of them ventured into the storm. Ruth led Duke while Jacob, leaning heavily on Thomas, guided the milk cow. Mary carried the chicken coop, Bessie and her chicks tucked safely inside, her small frame bent against the wind but determined. The water had risen alarmingly fast. What had been their lower pasture was now a lake, and it was creeping steadily toward the barn. They worked by lamplight and lightning flashes, leading the confused and frightened animals to the slight rise behind the cabin where an old lean-to provided some shelter. Thornton appeared out of the storm like a specter, his horse sliding in the mud. Jacob tensed, expecting trouble, but the man's face showed only concern. "My place is flooding out," Thornton shouted over the wind. "Lost half my herd already. You need help?" It was Ruth who answered. "We're managing," she called back, then added with visible effort. "But thank you for asking." Thornton nodded, started to turn away, then looked back. "I was wrong," he said, the words barely audible over the storm. "About things. You're good folk." Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness and rain. They finished securing the animals and made their way back to the cabin, soaked through and exhausted. Ruth insisted on checking Jacob's head wound again while the children changed into dry clothes. "That was good of you," Jacob said quietly. "What you said to Thornton." "He's still an ass," Ruth replied, but without heat. "But even asses deserve Christian charity in a storm." That startled a laugh out of him, which made him wince as it jarred his head. Ruth's hands stilled in their work. "Carefully," she murmured. "I can't afford to lose you." "Can't afford?" He tried to make it a joke, but something in her expression stopped him. "Can't afford," she repeated firmly. "This ranch, the children, they need you." She paused, then added so quietly he almost missed it. "I need you." Before he could respond, Thomas and Mary emerged in their nightclothes, and the moment passed. They spent the rest of the night huddled together near the fire, listening to the storm rage outside. Ruth told stories to distract the children from the wind's howling, tales of Noah and his ark that seemed particularly appropriate. "Will our animals be all right?" Thomas asked, pressed against Jacob's good side. "We did our best." Jacob told him, "Sometimes that's all you can do. The rest is in God's hands." Sometime near dawn, the wind finally began to die. The rain slowed to a drizzle, then stopped. In the gray pre-dawn light, they ventured out to survey the damage. The landscape had transformed. The lower pasture was indeed a lake, brown water stretching to where the barn stood like an island. Debris littered the yard, branches, an old wagon wheel from God knows where, what looked like half of someone's chicken coop. But the cabin had held. The animals, though miserable and muddy, had survived, and miraculously, the barn still stood, water lapping at its foundation but not yet inside. "We made it," Ruth breathed, and Jacob heard tears in her voice. "Together," Mary added, slipping her hand into her mother's. "Together," Thomas echoed, grinning despite his exhaustion. Jacob looked at his family, muddy, bedraggled, standing in the wreckage of the storm but unbroken. His head throbbed, his shoulder ached, and he knew the cleanup would take weeks. The flood would bring new challenges, new hardships. But Ruth was right. They'd made it. Not through his strength alone, not through stubborn independence, but together, as a family. The sun broke through the clouds then, painting the floodwaters gold and setting the remaining raindrops sparkling like diamonds. It was, Jacob thought, the most beautiful morning he'd ever seen. The recovery from the flood took its toll on everyone, but perhaps none more than Jacob. His shoulder, re-injured during the storm, refused to heal properly. By February, he could barely lift his arm above his waist, and the constant pain had worn grooves of exhaustion around his eyes. Yet he continued to push himself, rising before dawn to tend what livestock remained, working until well after dark to repair the flood damage. Ruth watched him with growing concern. She'd taken on more and more of the heavy work, her hands growing rougher, her back aching from burdens no woman should have to bear alone. But she bore them without complaint, just as she'd borne everything else life had thrown at her. It was on a cold March morning that things came to a head. Ruth was splitting wood behind the cabin, a task that had always been Jacob's, when a delegation from town appeared on the muddy road. She recognized the banker, Mr. Fitzgerald, his thin face pinched with disapproval beneath his derby hat. Beside him rode Sheriff Watson and, surprisingly, Miss Downing from the school. Ruth set down her axe, wiping her hands on her apron. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and she knew she must look a sight, more laborer than lady. She lifted her chin anyway. "Mrs. McAllister." Fitzgerald began without preamble. "We need to discuss your situation." "My situation?" Ruth kept her voice level, though her heart had begun to race. "This ranch is 3 months behind on its mortgage payments." The banker continued. "The flood damage, the loss of livestock, it's clear you can't maintain the property." "We're managing," Ruth said firmly. "The spring calves will help us catch up." Sheriff Watson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ruth, Mrs. McAllister, folks are talking. They're saying Jacob's too injured to work, that you're out here trying to run this place alone. It ain't proper. And the children," Miss Downing added, her voice dripping with false concern. "They've missed so much school. Perhaps they'd be better served in town, with a proper family to care for them." Ruth felt the blood drain from her face. "Are you threatening to take my children?" "Not threatening," Fitzgerald said smoothly. "Simply pointing out options. I've had an offer on this property, enough to clear your debts and give you a fresh start back east. Sometimes the kindest thing is to admit defeat." "Who made the offer?" But Ruth already knew. "Thornton." The banker's silence was answer enough. "Get off my land," Ruth said quietly. "Now, see here," Fitzgerald began. "I said get off my land." Ruth's voice cracked like a whip. "You come here, to my home, and threaten my family. Suggest I abandon my husband when he needs me most. You should be ashamed." Miss Downing sniffed. "Your husband? Yes, we all know how that arrangement came about. A business transaction. Nothing more." Ruth stepped forward, and something in her expression made all three visitors take a step back. "You know nothing," she said, her voice low and fierce. "You see a mail-order bride, a desperate widow who sold herself. You don't see the man who took in my children as his own, who works himself to exhaustion to keep us fed and sheltered. You don't see the love that's grown here, built day by day through hardship and hope." She paused, gathering herself. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier but no less determined. "We will not lose this ranch. We will not be separated. And if you try to take my children, I'll fight you with every breath in my body." The delegation exchanged uncomfortable glances. Finally, Sheriff Watson spoke. 3 months, Ruth, that's all Fitzgerald can give you. After that," he shrugged apologetically, "after they'd gone." Ruth stood in the yard for a long moment, fists clenched, fighting the urge to scream. Then she heard it, a sound from the barn. Jacob, trying to lift a hay bale with his injured arm, gasping with pain. She found him on his knees, face gray, good arm wrapped around his ribs. "Damn it," he was muttering. "Damn this useless body." "Stop," Ruth said sharply, dropping beside him. "Just stop." He looked up at her, and she saw tears of frustration in his eyes. "I heard them," he said. "Fitzgerald and the others. They're right. I can't provide for you, can't protect you. What kind of man?" Ruth placed her fingers over his lips, silencing him. "The kind of man who nearly killed himself trying to save our livestock. The kind who teaches my son to be brave and my daughter to be strong. The kind who keeps his promises, even when keeping them costs everything." She helped him sit back against the barn wall, then surprised them both by settling beside him, not caring about the dirty straw or the impropriety of it. "They want to take the children," he said dully. "They won't." Ruth's voice was steel. "I won't let them. How can we stop them? I can barely work. We're drowning in debt." "Then we fight smarter, not harder." Ruth was quiet for a moment, thinking, "The Andersons, they mentioned needing help with their spring planting. I could work for them, earn wages." "Ruth, no, you already do too much. And Mrs. Miller takes in sewing. I'm good with a needle, evening work, after chores." She was warming to her plan. "Thomas is old enough to help more. Mary, too. We're a family, Jacob. We work together." He was shaking his head. "I've failed you, failed all of you." Ruth turned to face him fully, taking his face in her work-worn hands. "You listen to me, Jacob McAllister. You have never failed us. Never. You've given us a home, a name, a future. You've given my children a father they can be proud of. You've given me—" She paused, gathering courage. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have again. Partnership, trust, love." His eyes widened at the last word, searching her face. "Ruth, I love you, she said simply. Not because you're strong or successful or can provide for us. I love you because you're good and kind and stubborn as an old mule. I love you because you carved that wooden dog for Thomas even though your hands shook. Because you let Mary read to you even when you're exhausted. Because you look at me and see more than a desperate widow. Jacob lifted his good hand to cover one of hers. I've loved you since the day you stood in my yard and demanded I promise to care for your children, he said roughly. Maybe even before, when I saw your picture and read the strength in your eyes. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing this shift between them. Then Ruth spoke again, practical as always. So we fight, together. We'll find a way to save this place. That afternoon, Ruth called a family meeting. She stood before the fireplace like a general addressing troops, laying out their situation honestly. The children listened with solemn faces as she explained about the mortgage, the threats, the 3-month deadline. Are we going to lose our home? Mary asked quietly. Not if I can help it, Ruth said. But I need everyone's help. We all need to work, to sacrifice. It won't be easy. I can get a job in town, Thomas said immediately. Mr. Murphy might need help at the store. I can take in mending, Mary added. Mrs. Anderson said I have neat stitches. Ruth felt her throat tighten at their quick offers. These children, who had already lost so much, were ready to fight for this new life they'd built. What about school? Jacob asked from his chair. We'll manage, Ruth said. Evening lessons, weekends, education matters, but keeping our family together matters more. And so began their campaign to save the ranch. Ruth rose at 4 each morning, did her own chores, then rode to the Anderson place to help with their planting. Thomas split his time between school and working at Murphy's store, proudly bringing home his meager wages. Mary took in mending, her nimble fingers working late into the night by lamplight. The community, which had been so quick to judge, began to take notice. Amy Anderson, working beside Ruth in the fields, spread word of the family's determination. Mrs. Miller, collecting Mary's neat mending, told her church circle about the little girl who fell asleep over her sewing but never complained. Slowly, attitudes began to shift. Orders for mending increased. Sam Anderson paid Ruth fairly and recommended her to others needing seasonal help. Even Miss Downing, shamed by her students' defense of the McAllister children, quietly arranged for Thomas and Mary to receive their lessons in packets they could complete at home. One evening in early May, as the family gathered for a late supper after their various labors, Jacob cleared his throat. I have something to show you, he said, producing a small leather pouch. He emptied it onto the table. Coins spilled out. Not a fortune, but more than they'd seen in months. How? Ruth breathed. I've been carving, Jacob said almost shyly. Evenings, while you all work, toys, mostly. Murphy's been selling them in the store. Says folks from as far as Laramie are asking after them. Ruth picked up a small wooden horse, marveling at the delicate detail. Even with his injured arm, Jacob had created something beautiful. We're going to make it, Thomas said wonderingly, counting the coins. We're really going to make it. Maybe, Ruth said cautiously. But hope bloomed in her chest. If we keep working, if we stay together. That night, after the children were asleep, Ruth found Jacob on the porch, carving by moonlight. She settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Thank you, she said simply. For what? For not giving up, for fighting alongside us even when you're in pain. She paused. For loving us. He set down his knife and wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her close. Thank you, he echoed, for reminding me that strength isn't about doing everything alone. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead. The ranch spread out before them, battered by drought and flood, mortgaged and threatened, but still theirs, still home. 3 months. They had 3 months to save everything they'd built, but sitting there with Jacob's arm around her, feeling the solid warmth of him, Ruth believed they could do it. They were no longer a rancher and his bought bride. No longer desperate strangers bound by necessity. They were a family. And families, Ruth had learned, could survive anything if they stood together. Spring arrived in full glory, painting the Wyoming plains with wildflowers and fresh grass. The ranch, which had looked so desolate through the winter months, began to show signs of renewal. The creek ran clear and steady. The surviving cattle grew fat on new pasture, and the garden Ruth had planted began to sprout with promise on a warm June morning, with only 2 weeks left before their deadline with the bank. Jacob stood at the edge of their property, finally able to raise his arm without wincing. The months of rest and gradual exercise had done their work. He wasn't the man he'd been before the injuries, but he was whole enough to pull his weight again. "Counting our blessings," Ruth's voice came from behind him. She carried a basket of eggs, her face flushed from the morning's work, but smiling. "Counting our cattle," Jacob replied, pulling her close with his good arm. 23 head, including the new calves. The horses are healthy, the chickens are laying well, and that garden of yours looks like it could feed half the county. And your carvings are bringing in steady money," Ruth added. "Thomas earned enough at Murphy's to buy seed for the fall planting. Mary's mending work has paid for flour and coffee all spring." They stood together, looking over what they'd built, not just maintained, but improved through their shared labor. The cabin had a new addition, small but sturdy, giving the children a proper room of their own. The barn stood straight and true, its lean corrected during the rebuilding after the flood. Everything spoke of hard work and hope. "Do we have enough?" Ruth asked the question that haunted both their thoughts. "For the mortgage?" "We'll know soon enough. Fitzgerald's coming today to collect," as if summoned by his name. Dust appeared on the eastern road. But it wasn't just the banker's buggy. A whole procession of wagons and riders followed behind. Ruth's hand tightened on Jacob's arm. "What is this?" They didn't have long to wonder. The procession pulled into their yard, and Jacob recognized nearly every family from the surrounding area. The Andersons were there, the Millers, the Clearys, even families from town he'd barely spoken to before. Fitzgerald stepped down from his buggy, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Behind him, Sheriff Watson helped someone else descend, Judge Harrison from the county seat, his black robes dusty from travel. "Mr. McAllister, Mrs. McAllister," the judge said formally. "I understand there's a matter of mortgage payment to be settled today." "There is," Jacob said carefully, not understanding why it required a judge and half the county to witness it. Sam Anderson stepped forward. "Before any business is conducted, Your Honor, the community has something to say." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Amy Anderson joined her husband, carrying a wooden box. "We've watched this family work themselves to the bone to save their home. Ruth labored in our fields for fair wages, never complaining, never asking for charity, but we're a community, and communities take care of their own." She opened the box, revealing a collection of money, bills and coins jumbled together. "Everyone here contributed what they could. It's not charity," she added quickly. Seeing Ruth's expression, "It's investment, in good neighbors, in people who've proven their worth. The children, too." Mrs. Miller spoke up. "Mary's been teaching my young ones their letters in exchange for her mending work. And Thomas, that boy's got the makest of a fine man, working at the store and still keeping up his studies." Old Tobias Cleary stomped forward. "Even helped me with my harvest when my rheumatism got bad. Wouldn't take a penny for it neither. Just said neighbors help neighbors." One by one, people stepped forward with stories. How Ruth had shared her limited flour when the Clearys ran short. How Jacob's carved toys had brought joy to children who had little. How the family had taken in strangers and made them belong. Through it all, Thornton stood at the edge of the crowd, his face unreadable. Finally, he too stepped forward. "I've been a fool," he said gruffly. "Worse than a fool. I let greed and loneliness turn me into someone I'm ashamed of." He pulled out a leather pouch, heavy with coin. "This is what I saved to try to buy your land. I'm adding it to the pot. It's the least I can do to make amends." Ruth was crying openly now. and Jacob found his own eyes weren't exactly dry. Mary and Thomas had appeared from the cabin, drawn by the commotion, and stood wide-eyed at the scene before them. Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Fitzgerald, I believe you have business to conduct?" The banker looked like he'd swallowed something sour. "The mortgage amount, with interest and penalties, comes to $347. Amy Anderson stepped forward with the box. "Count it," she said simply, with shaking hands. Jacob and Ruth counted the collection. Bills crumpled from work-worn hands. Coins saved from egg money and extra chores. Even a gold piece that looked suspiciously like the one Doc Henley wore on his watch chain. $412? Ruth whispered. "It's enough. It's more than enough." The judge nodded approvingly. "Mr. Fitzgerald, I trust you'll provide a receipt marking this mortgage paid in full?" "But they were months behind." Fitzgerald started to protest. "And now they're paid in full," Judge Harrison said firmly. "Unless you'd like me to investigate some of the complaints I've been hearing about your banking practices." Fitzgerald subsided, pulling out his receipt book with poor grace. As he wrote, Sam Anderson raised his voice. "This here's a testament to what family means on the frontier. Not just blood kin, but chosen family, community family. We all came out here seeking something. Land. Freedom. A new start. But what we found was each other." "Here, here," several voices called out. The judge handed the receipt to Jacob with a smile. "Congratulations, Mr. McAllister. The ranch is yours, free and clear." Jacob looked at the paper, then at Ruth, then at their children. Finally, he faced the crowd. "I don't have words," he said roughly, "except thank you, and to promise that as long as we have a roof and food, any of you are welcome to share it." What followed was an impromptu celebration. Someone produced a fiddle, another had brought cider. Tables were hastily set up in the yard, and food appeared as if by magic, dishes the women had apparently prepared in secret for this moment. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Jacob found himself by the fire they'd built for light and warmth. Thomas was showing other boys his roping skills. Mary was helping serve food with quiet grace, and Ruth was deep in conversation with the other women, her face animated with joy. "It's a good thing you've built here," a voice said beside him. He turned to find Judge Harrison, cup of cider in hand. "We built it together," Jacob corrected. "All of us. That's the secret, isn't it?" The judge smiled. "Out here, away from civilization's conveniences, we learn what really matters: family, community, the promises we keep." Later, as the gathering wound down and families prepared for the journey home, Ruth found Jacob by the corral, carved wooden dog in his hand, the one he'd finally finished for Thomas. "From lonely rancher to patriarch of a clan," she teased gently. "How does it feel?" He set down the carving and pulled her close. "Like coming home," he said simply. "Like finally understanding what home really means." "And what does it mean?" Jacob looked over her shoulder at their cabin, warm light spilling from its windows, at their children, helping with the cleanup, at their neighbors, calling out final farewells and promises to visit soon. "It means a place where love grows stronger through hardship, where promises are kept even when keeping them costs everything, where strangers become family and family becomes everything." Ruth rose on her toes and kissed him, there in the deepening twilight with the whole world to witness. "Then we're home," she whispered against his lips. "We're finally home." As the last wagon disappeared into the darkness and the children came running to say goodnight, Jacob McAllister stood with his wife on the land they'd fought to keep. The stars were coming out, brilliant in the clear Wyoming sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did on the frontier. But tonight, they were together. They were family. They were home. The lonely rancher who'd bought a wife had found something money couldn't purchase, a love forged in hardship, tested by trials, and proven true. And the woman who'd said she'd enter his cabin only if her children became his too had kept her promise, just as he had kept his. in the end, that's all that mattered. On the vast plains of Wyoming, under the eternal stars, a family stood together, not bound by blood alone, but by choice, by struggle, and by a love that had grown slowly, steadily, season by season, until it was as much a part of the landscape as the mountains themselves. Thank you so much for listening to this story from the Wild West. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps on a long drive? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Jacob and Ruth's journey in the comments below. Your stories and feedback mean the world to us, and we love connecting with listeners from all around the globe.